In the spring of 1846, a dozen families, servants, and hired hands gathered in the Midwest and fixed their hopes westward. They were not driven by whim. The newspapers, guides, and sermons of the age promised land, opportunity, and a new life beyond the Mississippi. The group that history would label the Donner Party left Springfield, Illinois in mid-April with covered wagons, trunks of personal possessions, seed grain, and a belief as American as the frontier itself that the country expanded as far as a determined family could pull a set of oxen. By the time those wagons met the long ribbon of the Oregon and California trails, the small caravan had swelled to dozens of people traveling together for safety and mutual aid. The leaders were the Donner brothers, George and Jacob, and among them was James F. Reed, a blunt, forceful man who would become key to both the group's survival and the story's bitter argument afterward. These pioneers were ordinary folks who were willing to risk extraordinary hardship for a shot at California's promise. The journey west was not a simple highway. It was a braided network of routes that funneled immigrants along rivers and passes. Into that network stepped a loud, ambitious promoter named Lansford W. Hastings, author of a popular guidebook that promised a cutoff, a shorter, faster route into California that would shave weeks from the trip and spare wagons the treacherous descent of Weber Canyon. Hastings' plan was persuasive. His pamphlet made the gamble look like a sure thing. For desperate families racing the seasons, saving a month on the trail was tempting enough to take chances. The Donner Group accepted Hastings' suggestion and turned off the established trail at Fort Bridger in late July. The argument Hastings offered, that his shortcut would save hundreds of hard miles, proved tragically wrong. The new path was difficult, poorly scouted, and in some calculations actually longer than the established route. It cost them not just days, but essential oxen, food stores, and the stamina of men and animals alike. At Fort Bridger, the party split from others bound for California and pushed into country that required road building as much as travel. Wagon wheels chewed new ruts, men hacked through willows and cut trees, and the procession stretched for miles. Where a well-traveled trail offered clear water holes and known campsites, the Hastings cutoff forced the Donner Party into long, dry stretches, brutal climbs, and the flat cruelty of the Great Salt Lake Desert. An 80-mile drift across a lake bed where water was scarce and the sun burned the oxen's flanks. Oxen died, wagons bogged down in alkali mud and dust, pickets exhausted their hay and grain. Each delay thinned the margin between the immigrants and the Sierra Nevada's winter. By the time the party rejoined more established wagon roads and finally made for the mountain passes into California, that margin had been fatally reduced. The decision to follow Hastings' advice, one man's hopeful marketing, one group's willingness to gamble, would be the hinge upon which everything that followed swung. Personalities complicated the map. George Donner was a reserved farmer who did not have the charisma of a leader, but had wealth and the will to begin anew. James Reed was opposite, outspoken, quarrelsome, determined. Reed's temper and practical skills made him both a leader in the camp and a lightning rod for conflicts. Other families included the Breens, the Graves, the Murphy family, the young Eliza Donner and her siblings, and a handful of hired men and guides who joined along the way. A man named Louis Kesserberg, a Bavarian immigrant with a reputation for eccentricity and obsessive thrift, would later be singled out in rumor and accusation. All of them were the sort of Americans who populated the historical West, ambitious, mobile, and attached to the idea of a new start. They were ordinary people whose ordinary mistakes and extraordinary misfortunes would make a story that has refused to die. The calendar matters in a tale about seasons. The wagons left Illinois in April and reached the frontier of the Great Basin in midsummer. They entered Fort Bridger and began the Hastings cutoff in late July. These calendar spans, late starts, months lost to the desert road building, and days bled away by lost oxen and bogged wagons, meant that a journey that should have reached the Sierra by early autumn instead neared the Sierra Nevada in October. When weather turns in the mountains, Even a week makes a difference. For the Donner Party, that difference would be the difference between crossing a high pass and being imprisoned by a mountain winter.
October in the Sierra Nevada can be deceptive. At low elevations, the light still promised harvest in autumn. Higher up, the clouds spoke of a season already moving in. When the Donner wagons finally reached the Truckee River corridor and the approach to Donner Pass in October 1846, the weather turned faster than anyone expected. Storms swept down with a suddenness that had caught more than one well-ventured traveler off guard in the mountains. The party's trains were stretched out, wagons dotted the slopes. Men argued over whether to push for a pass or to take shelter and build cabins. That argument, in the thin arithmetic of snow, momentum, and oxen, is the pivot of the tragedy. Some wagons reached temporary camps at the lake, now called Donner Lake. Others stalled on the mountain slopes below. The first snows came early and heavy, a stifling white that blurred the ridgeline and buried the familiar marks of a summer trail. By mid-October, the emigrants were entombed by weather they had neither expected nor prepared for. As winter tightened, the group split into smaller encampments where they could build shelters and conserve what food remained. Men who could still ride pushed downslope to fetch timber and forage. Women wrapped children in spare blankets and tried to make cabins as windproof as possible. The stock, the oxen, horses, and mules whose fate had always been bound to human survival, began to fail. The hardships of the Hastings Cutoff and the desert crossings had already thinned the herds. As grass disappeared beneath snow and the animals' feed ran out, the pioneers faced the cruel arithmetic of available mouths and available meat. When the cattle were gone, there was rawhide and cobbled leather and whatever rancid scraps the wagons had left, but not enough to keep grown men walking and working. It was at this edge, when warmth, strength, and the raw will to keep going began to run out, that the camp's most monstrous decisions happened. Contemporary accounts record how the simplest acts of survival took on a ritual quality: chopping and sawing, rationing scraps of flour, attempting to protect babies with shifting bodies of blankets, and retelling memories of gardens and harvests now impossibly distant. In mid-December, when the food stores had dwindled to almost nothing and frost had thickened overnight into layers that buckled cabins, a small party chosen for physical fitness set out on snowshoes to cross the pass and fetch help. They called themselves later the Forlorn Hope, a term that held both grim humor and despair. On December 16th, about 15 of the strongest put on snowshoes fashioned from rawhide and scavenged wood and started down into a vast white country that had no landmarks. Their march became a grinding test of will. They walked for days, digging shelter from drifts, scavenging the bodies of dead animals, and watching companions fall away. Hunger does strange things to the mind and body. The Forlorn Hope soon found themselves forced into choices that law and culture forbade. Some members died naturally of exposure and exhaustion. Others, in the stress of survival, chose the only immediate source of sustained protein available to them: the bodies of the dead they had left behind. Accounts of this desperate march, its hunger, its conversations, and the moment when cannibalism was first taken are the most haunting in the record. They describe a slow slide from civilized restraint to an animal calculus of survival, in which a roast of human flesh could be something like a sacrament, nourishment, shame, and the final refuge of those who had no alternatives. Cannibalism is a word that shocks modern readers, but history asks a different thing: to understand the conditions in which people who were otherwise neighbors and churchgoers made these choices. The survivors' testimonies and the way later writers told the story blend memory and shame, accusation and self-justification. Some survivors insisted that cannibalism was only resorted to after natural deaths. Others suggested darker acts and even murder in a few terrible instances. Over the decades, the tale hardened into a set of images: roasts over a pit, pitiful children handed from one mother to another to preserve their lives, and the last embers of a cabin watched by a parent who would never wake from sleep. Archaeological inquiries and forensic studies have complicated the simple narrative. Bones and artifacts that once seemed to confirm lurid details also draw ambiguous lines between human and animal remains, between cooked marrow and charred beef. But the central fact remains that hunger stripped many in the camps of the larger comforts of human community, and that some survivors ate the flesh of the dead to stay alive. History has debated degrees of responsibility and culpability, but it cannot wish away the basic truth of what hunger does to choice. The social map inside the camps shifted in direct proportion to the rumor mill outside them. Leadership eroded. Strong men who had once supervised mechanics and rationing were reduced to weak limbs. Priests and moral teachers found theology a poor bulwark against scurvy and exposure. Women and children paradoxically survived the ordeal at higher rates than adult men, a fact that demographers have considered carefully. Children's metabolism and the social instinct of caregivers helped the young alive even when fathers and older brothers failed. Families that remained together had better odds than single men scraping by. Small clusters of kin made sharing decisions that looked ruthless from the outside but pragmatic from the inside. Names that recur in survivor lists, Reed, Breen, Donner, Graves, Murphy, become more than genealogical entries. They are clusters of choices, mistakes, and acts of courage and violence. One person whose shadow lingers in the story is Louis Keseberg. He survived to be the last man brought out of certain camps, and the tales about him, of hoarding, of eating the bodies of the dead, of quarrels with other survivors, made him a popular villain in the newspapers that telegraphed the story east. Some stories painted him as monstrous. Others suggest he may have simply been a man whose harsh behavior made him an easy target in the communal narratives of guilt. The truth, as often in history, sits somewhere uncomfortable between rumor and record. Keseberg's behavior, like many details in the saga, was complicated, contested, and used by the survivors and later writers to make sense of an event that was truly beyond easy explanation.
Word of the trapped emigrants spread slowly into the valleys of California. The Mexican-American War had drawn many able-bodied men away. The early settlements had few resources, and winter weather delayed rescue parties. James Reed, who had been banished from the caravan months earlier after killing a man in a quarrel near the Sweetwater, rode hard through October and November, and then set out for help when he reached settlements. He and a handful of others eventually organized relief parties, and the first rescues, small and heroic, did not arrive until mid-February 1847. These first parties saved some children and the weakest survivors. Others required subsequent expeditions into a white world that had little mercy and fewer men with snowshoes and provisions. The rescues themselves were perilous. Rescuers met the same snow, the same blinding storms, and the same frozen passes. They brought the survivors out in groups, leaving and returning for others, and every rescue increased the public's knowledge of what had happened during the darkest months. By the time the final salvage parties left the mountains in the spring of 1847, more than 30 people from the original company had died in the camps or on the snowy slopes. Figures vary because historians count different people who joined or left along the way, and because of ambiguities at the edges of the record. Contemporary compendia tend to settle on numbers in the high 30s to low 40s dead, and roughly 40 to 48 survivors from an original group usually reported as 87. Those who made it out were not the same as those who started. Many families were broken, some children orphaned, and a triumphant American dream was stained with a moral horror the nation found hard to absorb. The bare arithmetic, names listed on rosters and in petitions for aid, tells one part of the story. The rest is the slow, human accounting of grief, gossip, and law. The rescue brought more than bodies and children home. It brought questions and a courtroom's worth of blame. James Reed's role, for example, became complicated, banished early for his violent temper, but also instrumental in organizing rescue efforts. He left an odd aftertaste of both heroism and culpability in historical memory. Lansford Hastings, the man who'd promoted the shortcut, faded into infamy and scorn. Newspapers loved a villain and a scapegoat,
and Hastings, with his confident but flawed route, fit the part. The West's governing institutions were still emergent. There was no simple mechanism to assign blame or recompense to the victims. Trials, claims, and personal letters proliferated across California and beyond, and the story became a morality play about greed, hubris, and the hazards of believing anyone who promised an easy way. Memory, rumor, and myth took hold quickly. The Eastward press gorged itself on the most sensational parts of the story. Publications printed lurid accounts of cannibalism and of acts that appeared to border on murder. Some of the coverage exaggerated details for readership and moral spectacle. Over the decades, the Donner Party became shorthand for everything Americans feared about the wide open: the dangers of an unregulated frontier, the unreliability of promoters, and the thinness of civilized restraint when resources ran out. Yet even as the melodrama solidified, historians and archaeologists have worked to recover more complex truths: who survived and why, how demographics shaped survival odds, and what physical evidence can say about what actually occurred around those frozen camps. Excavations at sites like Alder Creek have yielded artifacts, animal bones, hearths, and ambiguities that complicate the simple headline of cannibalism. DNA testing and forensic analysis have sometimes failed to find definitive proof of human bone consumption at certain sites, complicating a narrative that was long taken as absolute. That ambiguity does not erase suffering in the camps. Instead, it shows how stories of survival can harden into legend in ways that obscure everyday details and quieter acts of mutual care. For those who survived the ordeal, the aftermath was complex and raw. Children were carried down the pass and put into the care of other families. Some survivors remarried quickly in the frontier scarcity of women. Others returned east. The Donner name, once respectable in Illinois and the Midwest, became a brand of sorrow. Places in California, Donner Lake and Donner Pass, kept the name, a memorialization that both honors and commodifies memory. In time, the pass would become a critical transportation artery, a highway scar cut into the Sierra, and the tragic narrative of the emigrants would ride above traffic in the form of historical markers and museum exhibits. The West pressed on. The country grew and stitched new roads across old scars. Memory, especially the memory that teaches, helped makers of later trails learn safer timings and better warnings for emigrants. History's more sober assessments move beyond lurid headlines to analyze the practical causes, seasonality and weather, the miscalculation that was the Hastings cutoff, decisions made by families facing immediate needs, and the demographic patterns that favored the survival of children and women in that harsh winter. Scholars point out that the Donner Party's tragedy is not only a story about extremes of human behavior, but also about the fragility of logistical planning in a pre-industrial migration, about how promotional literature, a guidebook, a confident letter, can send dozens of people down a worse path, and how luck and timing can separate those who make it from those who do not. It is the combination of error, misfortune, character, and environment that makes the Donner Party a case study in the complexities of American expansion. The American imagination treats the Donner Party as a parable. It asks whether a civilization can be judged by what its members do when they lose the things that define it: money, law, convention. Historians more cautiously ask different questions. How did resources, age, and family ties influence who survived? How did the route's misjudged risk shape the outcome? How do stories change in retelling when shame and sensationalism push facts into legend? Museums in Truckee and at Donner Memorial State Park collect letters, artifacts, and survivor narratives that let visitors stand near the physical places where choices were made and feel the cold logic of elevation, wind, and snow. Students of the era read the story not to savor its horrors, but to understand the interplay of human agency and environmental constraint. In the small human stories, there are flickers of the noblest impulses. Mothers wrapped their babies with their warm bodies. Fathers tried to ration the last grain of flour for another day. Men who might have been villains by temperament carried children for miles on their backs. The stark acts of cannibalism where they occurred were not always perpetrated with malice. Often they were the last resort of people who had already watched companions die from cold and hunger. The complexity of these acts, the mingling of survival instinct, remorse, and later justification resists easy moralization. Some survivors never spoke of what they had done. Others explained it as an act of last necessity. Public judgment was immediate and indignant, but human memory retains a private set of calculations that rarely reach print. There are few neat endings in this story. Names that appear on rosters trail into different fates. Some survivors prospered in California's boom. Others drifted, haunted by what they had seen. The nation's appetite for expansion did not pause for reflection. The frontier moved on. Highways cut through the passes in stone and steel, and later generations drove through Donner Pass with little thought for the people who had once been trapped there by a jealous winter. Yet the story survives. Historians and descendants keep retelling it, balancing the lurid details with sober archival work. Recent archaeological work, careful, scientific, and sometimes surprising, pushes the narrative away from myth and toward evidence, but it also teaches that evidence can complicate and not always confirm the stories we most want to believe. What to take from the Donner Party in a modern age? It is a cautionary tale about hubris and the perils of shortcuts, certainly. It is also a human portrait of endurance, social pressure, and how communities behave when the state's protection ends at the edge of a map. It asks us to think about the ethics of survival and to remember that history's most sensational parts often obscure the quieter acts of care that make survival possible. And it reminds us that a map is not simply a piece of paper, but a web of relationships between promoters and travelers, between weather and schedule, between leaders' choices and families' fate. The tragedy at Donner Pass is therefore more than an event. It is a mirror held up to the expansion that made the United States what it is, and to the human beings, flawed, brave, terrified, who lived inside that expansion.